1 second, Mark Watney was running for his life. The next, the entire planet believed he was dead. The storm was too powerful to fight. Within seconds, the crew could no longer see him, and Mission Control had only one choice left. With the storm already swallowing the landing zone, Commander Luis ordered an immediate evacuation. Staying any longer could kill the entire crew. They ran for the rocket as fast as their suits allowed, but above them, the storm had already become something far more dangerous. Then the communication dish broke free. A structure weighing far more than Mark could ever survive was now moving directly toward him. The impact came before he could react. Mark disappeared into the storm, and for the crew watching from safety, it looked like the moment he died.
But Mark's suit sent one final message. His oxygen was leaking fast, and that meant there was still a chance he was alive.
Scan for his frequency, now!
They went back for him, knowing every second exposed them to the same storm. But the deeper they searched, the less they could see.
Watney! Mark!
The signal kept falling. Somewhere inside that red wall, Mark was running out of the one thing he needed most: air. Then the rocket itself began to tip. If they stayed, everyone could die.
Commander Louis, everyone fall back to now!
With the rocket becoming unstable, they had seconds to decide.
Everyone inside now!
Commander Louis looked back one final time, then ordered everyone inside.
The ascent vehicle escaped the storm. Below it, hidden somewhere beneath the dust, Mark Watney was left behind, and everyone believed they had just lost him.
Hours later, something impossible happened. Beneath the Martian dust, Mark opened his eyes. Somehow, he was still alive. Then Mark realized what the storm had done. A broken antenna component had become lodged against his suit, and somehow, the pressure was still holding. There was no doctor, no rescue team, and no time to hesitate. Mark broke away the exposed metal, then forced himself back onto his feet. And then he saw it, the habitat. His only shelter was still standing, but there was no sign of the others. Mark finally understood he was alone. Every step hurt, but the habitat was close. Mark dragged himself through the airlock, knowing that whatever happened next had to happen inside. Inside the habitat, Mark finally removed the damaged suit. He was exhausted and running out of strength. With no one else around, he knew he had to keep himself alive. Mark had no choice but to treat himself. Alone on Mars, every second mattered, and there was no one else coming to help. At last, the emergency was under control. But as Mark looked across the empty Martian horizon, he realized something terrifying. This was only the beginning. Mark had no choice but to treat himself. Alone on Mars, every second mattered, and there was no one else coming to help. At last, the emergency was under control. But as Mark looked across the empty Martian horizon, he realized something terrifying. This was only the beginning. The wound was closed, but the numbers were terrifying. How long could this habitat keep him alive? Then came another problem. The storm had destroyed the communication system. Even if Earth was listening, Mark had no reliable way to answer. A rescue would not come quickly. The distance between Mars and Earth meant that Mark might have to survive for years before anyone could reach him. The food was worse. Even if every ration was carefully measured, his supplies were nowhere close to what he would need for years. Mark recorded what might be his final message. He began searching for one reason to keep going. Then something changed. Mark could not control when rescue would come, but he could control what he did until it arrived. He counted every ration from the entire crew. The result gave him roughly a year of food. But that was nowhere near enough.
Then he saw something he had almost forgotten, a package of potatoes. And suddenly, Mark was no longer thinking about how long his food would last, but how to grow more.
If he could turn those potatoes into a crop, they could become something far more valuable than a meal. A renewable food supply that might keep him alive. Mark began preparing a small space for something that could change everything. It wasn't a farm yet, but it was the first step toward producing food. But the red soil lacked the nutrients his plants would need, forcing Mark to consider a far less pleasant solution. He turned to the resources already available inside the habitat, processing them carefully and mixing them into the barren soil. Then came the simplest part of the plan. Mark knew survival would depend on one thing he could not simply manufacture: a reliable source of food. Then came the simplest part of the plan: turning the remaining potatoes into dozens of chances for new life. One by one, he buried the pieces beneath the soil, knowing that without water, none of them would ever grow. Mark understood the chemistry, and he had the equipment. But on Mars, even a correct idea could become dangerous in seconds. His first calculation missed one crucial variable: the oxygen already circulating inside the habitat. Then, in a single instant, the experiment failed. Mark survived, but the message was unmistakable. Mars would punish every mistake. The next day, he tried again, this time measuring every variable, reducing the risk before making another move. And this time, it worked. Tiny droplets began to gather, the first real sign that Mark's impossible farm might actually survive. Now the precious water had to reach the soil. Every drop mattered, because there was no backup supply waiting for him.
He watered the first rows carefully, refusing to waste even a single drop of the resource he had worked so hard to create.
Days passed, and Mark repeated the same routine: measure, water, wait, and hope that something beneath the soil was finally changing. Then, after days of waiting, the impossible became visible: a tiny green shoot breaking through the red Martian soil. For the first time since the storm, Mark had something more powerful than supplies, proof that his own effort could keep him alive. While Mark celebrated one tiny victory, Earth believed a very different story: that the missing astronaut had never survived the storm.
But one analyst refused to accept the conclusion. Vincent noticed something that did not fit the official picture.
He ordered the satellite team to scan the landing zone again, searching for anything that could prove the equipment had moved.
Then the new images revealed something impossible. Equipment had moved, and fresh tracks crossed the soil around it. Vincent finally understood, the only explanation that made sense. Someone was alive down there, and that someone could only be Mark. At first, the director blamed the storm, but Vincent knew the tracks told a different story. Someone had deliberately moved that equipment. The evidence was finally impossible to ignore. Mark Watney was alive, and NASA had just discovered that its lost astronaut was still fighting. But NASA faced another problem. The world had already been told Mark was dead, and reversing that announcement would create a storm of its own. They chose caution. Mark's survival would remain tightly controlled until NASA could understand the risks of telling the crew who had left him behind. While Earth debated his future, Mark kept working. By then, survival was no longer an emergency. It had become his daily routine. Then Mark found the next problem. The future rescue site was thousands of kilometers away. It was far beyond anything he could reach on foot. His rover was not ready for a journey of that distance. So Mark did what he knew best. He began turning broken equipment into a new machine. He salvaged the best parts from one rover and combined them with another, slowly building a vehicle capable of carrying him across the planet. After hours of work, the machine finally came alive. It was rough, improvised, and far from perfect, but it could move. But another danger waited after sunset. Martian nights could become brutally cold, and Mark needed a power source that could keep the journey alive. After weeks of searching, Mark finally reached the forgotten machine that might give him one chance to speak to Earth again. He connected the ancient system to his remaining power supply, unsure whether decades of dust had already ended its final chance. Then something incredible happened. The old antenna moved, slowly turning toward the distant world Mark had almost stopped believing he would ever see again. Thousands of kilometers away, NASA's old ground equipment suddenly detected a signal from Mars, and the control room fell completely silent. When NASA sent the first command, the ancient camera moved. Mark instantly understood. Someone on Earth was finally listening. But the connection was painfully limited. So Mark created a simple system. One direction for yes, another for no. When the camera finally turned toward yes, Mark realized something he had almost forgotten. He was no longer facing Mars completely alone. 1 second, Mark Watney was running for his life. The next, the entire planet believed he was dead. Soon, Mark connected the Pathfinder to his computer. For the first time, messages could travel between Mars and Earth. Then came the message Mark had been waiting for. NASA was working on a rescue. For the first time, survival felt like a real possibility. But Mark had one question left. Did his crew know he was alive, or had they already continued their journey believing he was gone? The answer was no. His friends still believed he was dead, and that realization hit Mark harder than he expected. Now NASA had no choice. The crew finally learned the truth. Mark was alive, still fighting for his life on Mars. For a while, everything finally seemed to work. His crops were growing, communication was restored, and survival no longer felt impossible. Then, without warning, the fragile habitat suffered another failure. The airlock that protected Mark from Mars was beginning to give way. The pressure release threw Mark across the habitat. In seconds, the place he depended on for survival had become another threat. Mark managed to stabilize his suit and reach the habitat again. But when he looked inside, another disaster was waiting. His crops, the food he had spent weeks creating, were gone. Suddenly, years of careful planning had been reduced to a few remaining supplies. On Earth, NASA prepared one final emergency supply launch. If it worked, Mark could receive enough food to survive until the rescue mission arrived. Everything depended on this launch. For Mark, it was more than a rocket. It was the thin line between surviving Mars and running out of time.